I'm Ashley Czajkowski. I'm an intermediate artist. I have lived here in the desert in the valley for, oh my gosh, like 7 years, but I'm originally from a really small town in Kansas, so I have really rural roots, and all of my artwork kind of relates to that past. I deal a lot with nature and different elements of nature and sort of the human connection to that, and I think that a lot of that stems from my super rural upbringings, being like outside all the time when I was young. But I was always, as a kid, painting and drawing, and I would I remember vividly taking scraps of my own clothing, cutting it apart and making clothing for my troll dolls. I was super crafty and always doing things like that, inside and outside, making, oh man, mud sculptures, just ridiculous stuff. I was always very tactile, working with my hands, doing art things, and so it's interesting that my art focus became photography. And photography, especially digital photography, can be really almost ephemeral, because it's this digital capture, and it can live in a digital world forever. But because I have such a need to touch things and have tactile things, I think that's how my work, though it's photography based, became really interdisciplinary. So I use sculptural elements, I use 19th century photo processes to really make sure that I have some sort of tactile handle in the process of making imagery. When I first became interested in photography, at my middle school, which was in a super small town in Kansas, I was fortunate enough that we still had dark rooms, so silver gelatin, traditional black and white. And I remember one of the first cameras that I used to make a photograph, because this was pre-camera phones, right? One of the first cameras that I had was a pinhole camera, which was essentially just a box that we made in this middle school art class. And then I made a photograph using this box and silver gelatin paper, and I watched it magically expose in the darkroom. So for me, photography has always been really tangible, from the beginning. And even though eventually with technology I sort of moved kind of out of that, I always came back to traditional darkroom processes, using film, creating prints, having a hand in all of that, having a little bit more control. So even with digital, and now I do a lot of video, which is even more kind of ephemeral because it's projected light, I always somehow find a way to make it feel like it has a physicality. So when I do installations, and I use video, it's video projection onto objects or onto surfaces that feel like they have a physical presence in the space. And for me that's important, because then I feel like the interactions between people coming in to view the work, it just feels more potent, more visceral, more real when there's a physicality to the work too. I originally came here because I wanted to go to grad school at Arizona State University, but I wasn't accepted. I'm a little bit of a traveler, so I like to hop around, and I was living in Austin, Texas at the time, and I looked at, okay, I want to go to grad schools, let me just get a feel for where I want to go. And when ASU became my first choice, I was I'm just gonna move there. I'm gonna move there, I'm gonna get used to the new environment. So I moved here a year before, and thankfully I actually got into the school, so I've been here since then, and I am teaching now at some of the community colleges, and I was not love at first visit with the desert, because I come from a place that has 4 seasons and lots of change, but it slowly, the desert has grown on me, and it has this very, very specific kind of beauty, and it's almost more of a quiet, kind of subtle beauty, and the light is really intense but also really magical from a photography standpoint, because you really look at the quality of that light and how that affects the image that you're making, and it's really unique here. I think when I first moved here, I underestimated how much the environment sort of affects not only me, but also my artwork and my practice. It was a combination of the environment and also just influences from new media in grad school. So I was introduced to film, physical 16mm film, and I think because of the tactileness of that. It was a different way of, because I never was super interested in video until I did this 16mm film. And the combination of being introduced to that as a new medium and then being in this new and different environment, the work really started to shift. When I first came to grad school, I was making portraits of children, kind of outside, and I think about rural children and my own childhood as sort of as a little bit of like a little feral wildling kind of running around barefoot, you know. So that's the work I was making when I came here, but then it all kind of started to shift. I was a nanny for a while. I was photographing the kids that I nannied, but in this new environment, and it was suddenly sort of like the desert and the specific nature here began to start to change the work I was making. There's like this saying that the more personal you can make your work, the more universal it can become. So it was like, felt really at once very personal, but it also began to feel like speak to more of a broad idea about the natural elements of the desert and the human relationship to that. I became really interested in different ways that I could utilize the photographic imagery in kind of unexpected ways, and a lot of times that came down to materiality and output. So I did a lot of experimentation in grad school where I had all of these resources of ASU. So I did used a laser engraver to laser engrave images, but then I also became really interested in historic photo processes. And so the body of work that I'm working on now is making ambrotypes, which are photographic images on glass. Specifically, I'm making them on mirrors. And it's the same process that, if you know what a tintype is, from like Civil War era, the imagery on metal, it's that same process. And the images themselves are of coyotes, and all of the images have come from trail camera images. So these are like trail cameras are game cameras that you put out into nature, and they are motion triggered, and then they'll photograph whatever kind of passes in front of it. So I'm combining this sort of imagery that's super digitized with like a 19th century process, and putting it on the mirror to me was sort of trying to reference the idea that you can see yourself in this other being. So your image kind of blends with the image of the coyote and sort of comes in and out. And it's like the image of the coyote kind of ghost-like. Conceptually, the symbol of the coyote came out of, like, coyotes are everywhere, but they're very much a strong symbol of the Southwest, and something that I, from being here, kind of started to think about more and connect to. And I have a personal theory that coyotes are sort of like mirrors of humanity, because they are one of a handful of wildlife creatures that have learned to adapt to live in urban environments, and there's almost nowhere that humans live that coyotes also don't live. And so I like that sort of duality of those two things. So once I have a still image, then I'll open it. It's usually like a JPEG file, so I'll open it in Photoshop and I'll invert it into, well, it actually starts as a positive, so I'll just do any kind of minor image adjustments to make it a perfect negative for this process. And then I print it out on Pictorico, which is a transparency film. So you have the negative, it's cleaned, it's to the size of the plate that you want, so it has to be the same size as the plate. You also have to clean the plates really well with a mixture of calcium carbonate and alcohol. So it's essentially like a glass cleaner, so we'd use it for glass plate negatives or for ambrotypes, which is what these are. Okay, so it's ready. We can take these into the darkroom. Oof, you forget about that smell. The first step is pouring the plate. It takes a lot of practice to actually get a nice pour. So this is the Collodion, which has ether in it, so try not to breathe. And it's kind of a fast process because you want to do all of the steps while the surface of this plate is still wet. It's as thick as like actual maple syrup. And then while it's still wet, you take it over and you submerge it in the silver nitrate bath for about 4 to 5 minutes, depending on the pH of your silver bath, to sensitize the plate. After this point, it's light sensitive, and this is what actually makes it able to capture an image. So really the pouring part, if we were in an actual photo lab, could be done in the light. But this part, the opening up of the silver bath and the sensitizing of the plate, has to be done in this muted light. So this process is typically done, historically is done in camera. So you would actually, after this step, you would load it into a large format camera and then go to location, or oftentimes this process was done in a studio, so it was very quick to get to the location to make the image. But I learned in a workshop last summer how to make contact prints with digital negatives, which kind of opens up the possibilities for what you can make images of with this process. Because it is so fast, your subject matter has to be either really close or you have to have a portable darkroom, which many wet play photographers do. They make their own portable darkrooms that they can take anywhere. I have it set up here in a bathroom, so they would build essentially even like a suitcase darkroom for this process. To learn how to use a digital negative also allowed me to use the images from the trail cameras, which there's no other way to capture the kind of images that a trail camera gets, so it was the perfect marriage of the two. Turn on the light source for a certain amount of time for the exposure, which I've tested for. In my case, it's about 17 seconds, which is pretty slow actually for wet plate. It's usually, in camera, it would be something like 1/30th of a second. I mean, depending on the light, it could be faster than that. It's a special kind of light that's meant to imitate daylight, because wet plate, this process is really sensitive to the blue light spectrum. And then you take it over and pour the developer on top, and this is what causes you to see the image start to appear. And pretty much as soon as you start to see the highlights, you very quickly want to pour water over top of it. Just cold water, tap water is fine, and it stops the development process from happening. You definitely want to get all of the developer off the plate before you put it in the fixer. The water will bead up if there's still developer on it, and then once it starts to flow freely off the plate, then all the developer is gone. And then you want to put it in the fixer to make it no longer light sensitive. That's kind of what makes the plate able to be out in the light and no longer change. And after it starts to clear, you can turn the light back on. So it kind of turns invisible in the fixer when it clears, because it goes kind of from, looks like a negative when I first develop it, but it becomes sort of a negative and positive once it fixes. It's a fun mix of like science and art. My current body of work with the mirrors, I intentionally pick sort of vintage frames that look kind of timeless, not contemporary or modern, but kind of reference a history, another time, another place. And I think that visual kind of coincides with that idea that that's what photography can do. It sort of references a different time and place and can take you there. I think photography has so many other kinds of uses outside of the fine arts, which make it a really valuable skill to learn. And in classes, when I teach kind of beginning photography, I think one of the most important things, no matter how you're going to use this medium, but one of the most important things, if you really want to take photography seriously as an artist, as a professional photographer, as a wedding photographer, whatever, you have to slow down. It doesn't matter what tools you have, so use whatever tools are accessible and available to you. If you have an iPhone and that's the only means of making photographs, you can make amazing photographs with an iPhone. Everyone today takes hundreds of photographs every day without even really kind of thinking about it. You sort of almost take it instead of remembering things sometimes. If you want to take it seriously, it's important to slow down and really look at what you're photographing and pretend like you can only take 10 images. Like if you can only take 10 photographs, you're going to be a lot more specific about how you're framing, when you're looking at the light, how close you are to that subject. And just that sort of slowing down, being more mindful, being more intentional about the image that you make is gonna make you a better photographer, because it's really about seeing and capturing with intention. I teach a lot of classes. I teach an online digital photography class at ASU. I teach film and alternate processes, beginning photography at Scottsdale Community College. I'm really involved in the local art scene because I think that's really important. I'm a member of iLounge Collective in downtown Phoenix. So I show a lot in downtown Phoenix, but also in other places around the valley. I did a piece in a show in Chandler. I made a pinhole camera out of an ostrich egg. This was the camera that I took these images with. I show internationally as well. And I have a website, which is ashleyzakowski.com. And on my website, you can see all of my work in all mediums. I also have a Vimeo account that has all my video work on it as well, but it's linked to my website. I love when people look at my artwork, they leave with a question rather than thinking that they've found an answer. Make people think about something in a different way. Just like a photograph can provide a new viewpoint, a new way of looking. If it presents a question that will stay with someone, I think after they leave, that's what I would love my work to do.